Mr. Alterman, I think and we've sat here for 2 hours, and I appreciate you indulging us, but I think to your point that you've just been talking about for the last couple of minutes here about Iran being a country of politics and alluding to the fact that one of the issues is, from the world point of view and from an Iranian point of view, they're used to dealing with other nations that have princes, that don't have a legislative body. And I think that's one of the reasons why there's such a disconnect in this country, because we are talking about, we're not talking about little treaties and little things about tanks and small arms. The American people in the United States of America do understand this is an existential threat we're talking about. It's an existential threat now. We're talking about nuclear weapons. We're talking about an existential threat to Israel, and we're talking about an existential threat to our homeland. That's what we're talking about, or we would not be involved in this quote-unquote agreement. And, that's where I think a lot of the issue comes down to. We do have a separation of powers. Before we enter something like this, which existentially is a threat to all of us, the American people do have a right to know through their representatives sitting here today and having a look at that document and being allowed to vote. My question is on the perception of what's going to happen after this vote and whether we have enough votes to override a presidential veto. I happen to think it's going to be very close. Or what the president's been up to, he wouldn't have been up to, and he's really calling everybody in. He needs every single vote. What are we going to look like to the rest of the world as a split nation? There's no mandate. There's no giant majority. There's a couple of votes over the top that gets this bill through, which is, I think, where we're going to be. What perception, then, does the world take on that, a president that doesn't even have a majority of agreement in his own nation?
What I've read in foreign newspapers in the last week is something of surprise that there's a debate going on in the United States that's not going on in other places. We have people invoking the Holocaust. We have all sorts of things that in the rest of the world is just considered to be strange.
Because the rest of the world is not a superpower. The rest of the world doesn't dictate peace and freedom and fight for those things and fight for the freedom of people. The rest of the world are apples to us being an orange. So in the peer level that we had with Russia and China, and to my representative colleague's point, they're not victims or targets of this aggression. We're the victim and the target of the aggression. We're the ones that have watched Iran operate in Iraq, killing Americans, involving themselves in Yemen, involving themselves as the largest state sponsor of terrorism with Hezbollah and Hamas. We're the ones that have watched that. We're the ones that sent American blood and money to free these countries from the oppression of these terrorist regimes, largest state sponsor of terror, no changing the mind of the Ayatollah, and here we sit. And that's why the American people are so divided, and I think we're going to see a divided answer to this question on the agreement. It may lose by a couple, it may win by a couple, but at the end of the day, the perception then doesn't change.
So the perception that we're fighting
the perception
Iran
of the world, the perception of Iran doesn't change. There's no major majority. Yeah.
If I could just weigh in here,
yeah.
I think there's an important point here, I think, which is it's an open secret that I think a lot of folks on both sides of the aisle are concerned about whether this agreement is sufficient. And so what I anticipate will happen going forward as we look ahead is that whoever comes into office next as president, regardless of party, may find that this is insufficient, may find themselves wanting to strengthen the nuclear constraints on Iran. And that's going to be very tough to do. It's going to be very tough to get allied support for that, frankly, because when we talk about are the P5+1 with us, I was working on this in the mid-2000s, and I remember how hard it was to get even European support when they had the business deals they had with Iran. And I think getting support to strengthen the nuclear constraints in the future, which I think any president is inevitably going to want to do, is going to be quite hard. And then if you look at the agreement itself, it's clear that there are ambiguities over other relevant issues, like does the agreement give us the authority, give us the ability to impose sanctions on Iran for terrorism and human rights that sort of mirror the effects of the sanctions we're now relieving? We think that it does, and I think Secretary Kerry has testified to that point. It's not clear to me, though, that our allies agree with that. And so that sets up a very difficult situation for us because, who knows if we'll have that support.
Can I ask you one quick question before I run out of time? Other than Iran, I think in this agreement, personally, I think the United States is a loser. I think Israel's a loser. Who are the other winners in this agreement besides Iran? Who gains the most?
Well, I think those who gain the most are anyone who wants to do business with Iran, anyone who sees Iran as a strategic partner, frankly.
I yield back. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Stefanik.
Thank you, Mr.